rage, power, weakest, falls, money, driven, major, fraud, breathless, body, diamond, bones, wanna be it, wanna feel it.
Yo guys, what is up? Max on our first Descendant video, and today we're going over my updated guide to Viessa. Now, why are we making an updated guide to Viessa? Basically, when Season 2 dropped, they buffed the Living Daylights out of her. Not only did they rework some of her Transcendent modules, but they just buffed her damage massively, and she is now in a really good spot, both for bossing and for mobbing. Before, like, you really didn't use her against anything besides like Pyromaniac, and she didn't really have a spot in mobbing. She just puts out so much damage right now that I would like definitely move her up on our rankings of the Descendants, and I want to go over my build for her. I hope you guys enjoy the breakdown. Let's get right into it. So let's start by talking about the changes, and then we'll get into like the build specifics. So to start, her one didn't really change, still does a ton of damage. They did rework a bunch of her Transcendent modules. Right now I'm on Absolute Zero Viessa, where they increased her movement speed. So now in the Absolute Zero like movement speed Frost Road, this skill while you're running around will basically one-shot a lot of enemies if you pass by them and leave the frost ground, because you're going to be inflicting your like frostbite on them. That does a ton of damage, but you're also going to be getting a lot of movement speed. She's really speedy right now. They like basically tripled the damage of her cold snap ability. This hits for millions, and will delete both Colossuses and elites in front of you. And then they also made it so her fourth has more damage as well. So like the burst explosion of her fourth ability is hitting also multiple millions of damage. And they also, for example, in Absolute Zero, they gave her a skill crit rate increase. Viessa inherently was already good with skill crit rate. Absolute Zero was something you wanted to build crit rate off of originally, but now just sitting here, like standing alone, I'm sitting at 96% critical hit rate, which is dumb, because there's only a very few Descendants that can reach 100% skill critical hit rate, basically, and now Viessa is one of them, and she's going to be getting massive crit multipliers off of her abilities, and so the theme of Viessa right now is that she just hits for a lot of damage. Now, one other buff also happened corresponding with Viessa that actually directly improves her is the Blue Beetle buff. Now they buffed the Blue Beetle as well, so now the Blue Beetle gives you a 115% skill critical hit rate. So for example, for her like Cold-Blooded build, Cold-Blooded was a mod that we were using to get really low cooldowns on her fourth. We were going to scale it with crit anyways, but we can now, because Viessa's other abilities are fusion abilities, we now just get 100% more damage on her Cold-Bloodedness build, plus her 3 is hitting for 3 times the amount of damage, and her 2 is hitting way harder, and they're critting way more often. And so like there's a lot of different kind of stars aligning that are making Viessa really powerful. The last thing to mention is the inversion buffs. Viessa can have issues with mana and cooldowns if you're not playing like Cold-Bloodedness. But for example, the Archie boost gives a skill cooldown modifier whenever we hit 5 or more enemies with a skill, which is really easy to do for Viessa. It also gives us speed and range modifiers, and with Quantum Domain, this is like a 15 stack, like it doesn't decay. You just get more range and skill power, and there's like recovery buffs that we can get a bunch of mana back on Viessa, and so like there's so many things that are just going right for her right now. So now let's go over some builds, and the first one I want to talk about is my build that I like using for Infernal Walker. Now there's 2 modules that are really good on Infernal Walker. There is Absolute Zero, which gives her like basically 100% critical hit rate, and Cold-Bloodedness that gives her a bunch of cooldown. And I'm actually partial to Cold-Bloodedness. Both are really good. If you are going to do Cold-Bloodedness, the strategy that I use is I basically put down the 4, grapple away, put down the 4, grapple away, put down the 4, grapple away, and you can actually play really safe in this style. Your cooldowns are going to be super low, and you're going to be dealing a bunch of damage. We've got a decent bit of survivability with heat release and increased HP. We're going quad crit modules with range so that the 4 can make sure that it's hitting the boss. We got as much cooldown as possible, and we go focus on chill for even more cooldown. In the strategy here, there should be some gameplay playing on screen, is basically just going in, placing the 4, leaving, going in, placing the 4. If you've got mid-air maneuvering or long-distance maneuvering, it's really easy to just do that and get away. And while it might not be the fastest possible kills on Viessa, it feels the most comfy to me. And so that's why I really enjoy this setup. We put out a bunch of damage. We can kill the boss in like 1 minute. And you really just don't run much risk of actually dying. And so that was pretty important to me. The only big thing is grabbing heat release, even though it's not leveled up here. Getting the burn immunity, so you're losing a lot less HP, is really, really nice. The other really cool thing about using cold-bloodedness for bossing rather than absolute zero is absolute zero changes all of our abilities to singular, which means we can no longer benefit from the blue beetle. However, on cold-bloodedness, because we still keep our fusion abilities, we get to keep the ability to use the blue beetle to buff up our crit. So like this would be normal. Cold-bloodedness crit rate is 50% when we use the blue beetle, which we can only use on cold-bloodedness. We get that up to 68%. So you're like catching up to absolute zero in crit by also keeping the cooldowns and the playstyle that makes cold-bloodedness so good, in my opinion. By the way, for like non-Infernal Walker, literally anything besides Infernal Walker, I would just use this and then throw on Dangerous Ambush. Feels really good to me. And you could do the exact same with this setup, basically, and just swap this to absolute zero. It literally doesn't change. Now let's go over absolute zero. Now this is the build that I run for 400%. You'll note that there is a blank slot, which we'll talk about in a second. But basically the exact same build. We are going to be running 3 crit modules. We'll talk about the 4th one in a second. Because absolute zero does have some cooldown issues and you really want to be spamming, while it is not the most efficient mod possible here, I do run focus on singular mainly for the cooldown. The actual modifier benefit from that really is only going to affect your passive absolute zero and your frost road damage, as 68% modifier is not really going to do anything to a 3000 modifier or 1000 modifier or a 2800 modifier, but it is very nice for the cooldown and the fact that we can just run by enemies with frost roads and they will pretty much get one shot by it. Now you'll note that I do have an empty mod here. And that is because it kind of depends on your reactor what mod is best here. Originally, I had a pretty long explanation on what to use for this last mod, but just to simplify it, you should use emergency measures. Emergency measures is the best with absolute zero. Gets us to 100% crit chance, gives us a ton of damage, and feels really good for 400% dungeons. I personally am not using emergency measures. I'm going to be using Spear and Shield on my build, just because I was using for dungeons a singular crit rate boost ratio reactor that I had, and with that boost ratio thing, I'm getting, it's not showing because I'm not in a combat area, but I'm getting already 96% critical hit rate. So emergency measure doesn't really do anything for me, and then Spear and Shield gives me only 0.02% less damage than emergency, but it also can give me defense, and so a fully ranked Spear and Shield is actually really nice for 400% dungeons, and so that's what I'm running, but that is not something that is mandatory. You only really run Spear if you already have a crit rate roll on your reactor, and if you don't, I would just run emergency measures. Our cold snap build really doesn't change. This is basically what I use to farm spawning mobs for fusion reactors, and there's not really much to change here because it needs so many things. It needs the cooldown, it needs the double range mods, it needs the duration mods, it needs an MP collector so you can get mana back. So cold snap, while Viessa has changed, this cold snap build actually really hasn't, and note that you are going to be dealing a lot less damage with the third ability with this rather than her direct impact and non-dot version, but cold snap watch is still really good for mobbing. Our next setup is just cold-bloodedness for mobbing. If you didn't want to use the 400%, I do think 400% absolute zero is significantly stronger than cold-bloodedness now, but if you wanted to just spam as many skills as you possibly could, this is the setup that I use for it. And then the very last thing to talk about is bossing, both on cold-bloodedness and absolute zero. The only thing that you really change is you you take off that heat release for dangerous ambush for a whole bunch more damage, and I would use that on both of these. So like you would take off this focus on singular here and put dangerous ambush there. Basically kind of like the same build. Technically that goes there and dangerous ambush goes there, but you could use pretty much the exact same shell, and 4 crit mods, a damage mod, HP, double cooldown, dangerous ambush for cold-bloodedness, and absolute zero, and you will be deleting bosses. For her weapons, the blue beetle is fantastic. I don't really like build out the blue beetle because honestly, especially on Viessa, I'm just not shooting this thing. It is technically a solid weapon, but you're mainly holding it as just a stat stick, and so I don't really feel like you need to build all that much into it. The main thing with the blue beetle is just getting it 4 out of 4, so you can get that massive crit chance increase. The Frost Watcher is also a neat weapon on Viessa. So is the Clairvoyance. The Frost Watcher, to be honest, I didn't really have any plans on using this until the reactor changes go live. But the Frost Watcher reads that whenever we land a critical hit on an enemy at a certain distance, we get cold surveillance, which is applied to the target, and then we hit a weak point, we get sub-zero sensation, and then when we do this, we're going to get chill resistance per stack, and sub-zero sensation is going to give us chill skill power. The like chill skill power, I do think is technically worth it, which is from the sub-zero, and so really don't need like much of a build on this thing either. You just need it 4 out of 4, and you can shoot like a weak point and then get a bunch of damage from this thing. So yeah, that's my Frost Watcher. This is the build that I run on it. Basically, I was just trying to get enough crit rate on it so that we could, you know, technically have a decent chance of pulling up a crit so that you could proc its buffs. But other than that, I don't really care for the weapon all that much. But like, for example, things like Dopamagenic give us the like on weak point hit, we get crit rate. Better Insight gives us more crit rate. Bullet integration, edging shot, all these things to just try to get its crit rate up so you can proc its buffs more consistently. And then for reactors and components, obviously, if you're using absolute zero, you're going to want a singular reactor. If you're going to play cold-bloodedness, I recommend a tech reactor. This is the one that I was using for the Infernal Walker. Just damage to Colossus is definitely the most important thing. Chill skill power, tech, duration is technically pretty nice. But you're really looking for chill tech and damage to Colossus. Crit is also really good. For absolute zero, I strongly recommend finding for bossing. This is basically the reactor that you'd want, damage to Colossus and skill crit. And then for mobbing with absolute zero, you would want crit damage and cooldown. And then for components on Viessa, because she's super mana hungry, I've mainly been running the my just god tier components that I like using that have all like MP recovery in combat, max MP, MP recovery. I also was running a 2-piece invader just for the extra HP. And then for bossing, all about the Slayer set. Viessa hits really hard, absolutely loves the Slayer set. So the Polar Knight set gives you chill skill power, which is great. And then for each frostbite you inflict, which is what you inflict when you're using absolute zero, you get stacking crit damage, skill crit damage. And then when you kill an enemy, you're going to get like a kind of a frostbite explosion. I have tried this out in mobbing. I didn't really notice it in mobbing, but the like skill crit damage stacking up to 10 stacks is pretty gross. And so Polar Knight Sensor with absolute zero is a really nice synergy. Guys, that is going to do it for the video. I hope you enjoyed. Let me know what you'd like to see next. I do apologize that like the video updates have been a little bit slower. Let me know what you guys are thinking for like cadence on videos. I am trying to cover multiple games at a time with Path of Exile's 2 release, but I'm also not trying to rush my TFT videos. For example, I have finished my Voltia build basically on day 1, but I've been grinding trying to get it a 4 out of 4 because I didn't want to make too many judgments on it until I had it fully ranked. But if you guys just want to see like what I built on it, I can make those videos. But I deemed the weapon not very great, but it also like triples in DPS at a 4 out of 4. So I just like am trying to get everything fully completed so I could have those videos for y'all. But I do know that it's taking a little bit longer than usual, so I do apologize. I will catch y'all in the next one, guys. Take care. Peace.